Welcome to Therapy Unplugged, the podcast where two therapists offer insights to the real-life issues we all experience. We are your hosts, Sarah Benoit and Megan McCullough. Welcome back, listeners. This is Sarah and Megan. Hi, Megan.
Hi, Sarah.
How are you doing today?
I am doing very well, thanks.
Good. Okay, so today's episode, we are going to talk about burnout. And burnout can really happen to anyone. And I think my experience has been when people think about it, they think about it most connected to work or
Mhm.
career. And I mean, it's certainly a lot of what I've experienced with clients and whatnot is in that realm. But when I was thinking more about this, I think it happens too when people are juggling a ton of demands. Like they might be juggling a career, they might have kids that they're shuttling here and there, they might be caring for parents. And I mean, basically, bottom line is that every single moment of their life is filled. And I think that's where, when things get really too hectic and we don't take a minute to stop and whether that's pause, like we've talked about in the past,
Mhm. Mhm.
to slow things down, I think that's where we get on a slippery slope. And that's where that potential for burnout can happen. And I wanna get into a little bit about maybe the difference between burnout and stress and depression,
Mhm.
but before we go there, I'm just curious, in terms of, what you see in your practice, is burnout a big thing?
Such a good question, and this is my initial answer, and I know we're gonna get into the differences between, like you said, some of these things, but way back when, we did an episode on chronic overwhelm,
Mhm,
and I think I tend to see more chronic overwhelm than true burnout, and we'll get into what that means. I
mhm,
certainly have seen it, but but the kind of burnout I think that we might be discussing today is different than the chronic overwhelm, or you could maybe say it's one step more severe
mhm.
than just chronic overwhelm, and we'll get into how that manifests and what that looks like. So, I'm not seeing true burnout, like, with the majority of my clients, whereas I feel like chronic overwhelm does tend to come up over and over again.
Okay,
How
okay.
about you?
Well, that's part of why I asked, because 'cause I've had at least probably a handful, like maybe 5 clients within even the last 2 years
Mhm.
that this has been a problem for them, and it has been around work situations for the most part,
Yeah.
and to the point where these people have actually had to leave their jobs, and some have even left the career path totally because it's
Mhm.
just gotten to the point where there was, and not just the no joy part, but there was just nothing. Like, it was
Yeah.
that flat kind of, "I don't care."
Yes. Got it. No, yeah, and that is one of the as I was kind of preparing for this episode, that's one of the things that I wanted our listeners to know, because I think sometimes these titles that we're using sound very similar, right? But
Right.
that and you may have a different opinion, but that is one way that I'm distinguishing burnout from chronic stress or overwhelm, which is that my sense is that with my folks that have chronic overwhelm, there's still typically some motivation to put some focus and effort into finding solutions or making things feel better.
Mhm.
And my understanding is that if you get to the point of real, true, complete burnout, it's almost like there's a real significant decrease in motivation to the point where you may not even care anymore. right? And
Right.
there's a sense of ambivalence that I don't think necessarily maybe is there with just stress, daily stress or overwhelm.
Yeah, I agree, and I think what I've kind of come across is that probably the biggest difference, I mean, you mentioned that ambivalence, but I think and to kinda go back a little bit, it's I guess I'll use the term like pop psychology. Everyone uses these terms that when and the thing I should mention too with burnout is that's not a diagnosis. That is not
Right.
something you're going to find in the DSM that, you're going to, oh, yeah, you meet the criteria for this. I do think the biggest difference that I've come across is that stress, and this is where people, they correlate it to stress. They say, oh, I'm so burnt out. I'm so stressed. Well, when we're stressed, we feel. We feel a lot.
Right.
With burnout, we don't feel. We're
You
numb.
might
We
be
don't
numb.
care.
Mhm.
And that's, I think, the biggest difference. And I think what happens too is that unless you really kind of take the time with someone, that's where I think it has the potential to also become mislabeled as depression
Mm.
because there is maybe that apathy or the lethargy. And it's like, yeah, I don't care. But I think the biggest difference is when you can almost kind of test that theory, right? Where depression doesn't matter where you are, what you're doing. I mean, if you truly have a deep seated depression, you really don't care. Like nothing is going to phase you.
Mhm.
It doesn't matter if you're in the most beautiful place in the world. It
Mm.
doesn't matter
Right.
if you're surrounded by the people you love the most. Whereas with burnout, let's just say, for example, if you're burnt out around your job, you take time off or you go on a vacation and you get that respite and you feel,
Right.
recharged. So, I think that's one of the key differences. And I think it's important for people to pay attention to also because it's just paying attention to, what am I keeping an eye out for with myself or my
Mhm.
loved ones, that kind of
Mhm.
thing.
Yeah, no, I love the way that you put that, and I think it is helpful. Do you think this is just the way my brain works, big picture person, so now I'm imagining, and I'm curious if you would agree with this or not. I'm imagining kind of almost like this visual chart where perhaps the d the d eh, the daily stress, there's the daily stress, and then beneath that maybe is the chronic overwhelm going a little, like a little deeper, and then perhaps below the chronic overwhelm is the burnout,
Mhm.
and then even below that and more severe perhaps would be being diagnosed, say, with a major depression or something along those lines.
Yeah, I would. I like that visual that you've just outlined. I do think at the bottom of your kind of what I would call pyramid is
Mhm.
that there is some overlap when you get to that diagnosable place if it were
Sure.
depression.
Mhm.
And I think what stands out for me the most is that it does happen where people and this is there's actually a few different types of burnout.
Mhm.
And the most severe is what they call habitual burnout, and that's basically it's a critical stage, and it's chronic, where it just you're constantly in it. There's no break. You're not taking a break to try and remedy it, but those symptoms like fatigue, sadness, and even suicidal ideation, and I think that's where that fine line is, where I think if you've reached that
Mhm.
critical point, like,
Mhm.
that's you've gotta take good care of yourself because that's where you need to stop and reevaluate.
Got it. So, I know we're kind of getting into semantics here, but
Mhm.
perhaps if I'm hearing you right, habitual burnout could, maybe not always is, but could be the same or could be diagnosed at that point as depression.
Right, I think there are some similarities there for
Mhm.
sure.
Got it.
And again, I think it's testing it out. I mean, how severe to me, like, if you're having suicidal ideation, that's pretty severe.
Absolutely.
Um, and I think mean, I think we'll get into this in a bit, but it's also how do you prevent yourself from getting to that place?
Mhm.
And how do you recognize, okay, maybe I'm even heading in that direction? And this is where I found this was just from, how I understand things, my brain. When I saw there were different types of burnout, like that honestly surprised me because I kind of lumped it all together,
Mhm.
I think like most
Right.
people do.
Right.
But it made sense to me when I looked at it. So
Mhm.
for example, one of the categories is another category. The first one that we talked about, which is the most severe, is the habitual burnout, but the under challenged burnout. And
Mhm.
that basically is when you're bored and
Yeah.
you're feeling maybe underappreciated.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I thought to myself, I was like, it was interesting going through these 2 because I was trying to put myself in these categories to see if I've ever experienced this. And I thought back and I'm like, yeah,
Mhm.
I certainly have. And
Mhm.
thankfully I've not been at the habitual
Right.
burnout, but I've definitely been at the under challenged burnout.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's so funny you mentioned that one because that also the under challenged burnout, I took time to, really think about, well, have I experienced that? And I realized that, oh my gosh, yes. I
Mm,
remember, I'll just say this very briefly. Back when I got my bachelor's degree in psychology, so I had worked really hard in school and then didn't really know at that point, okay, now what do I wanna do with this? And I remember that I ended up well, in full transparency, there's not a whole lot you can well, a bachelor's in psychology is only gonna take you so far. I'll just put it
right.
that way, and I remember that I got a job, which I realize now was pretty darn cushy. It was working with special needs people, but the reason why I say it was cushy was because I was doing overnights a lot of the times at their homes when they're
Mhm,
sleeping, and so I was basically getting paid to sleep there, and then I had all of my days free. So this
mm,
is prior to having a child, this is prior to having responsibilities, and for a while, I remember thinking, "Oh, this is pretty great." But you know what? I remember the moment I woke up one morning, and I think I said to myself, "This is too I am bored." Like, I
mm.
am bored, and I think that a little bit of apathy started to set in. And
Okay.
so anyway, I just thought I'd share that because I I I don't know if I would have really thought of it back then as burnout, but clearly it was.
Mhm. So I'm just curious, so how did you solve that problem?
That's a really good question. I made changes. I I can't remember how long this took me. I don't think it took me too long. But I realized that, maybe this job had served me well when I first got out of school,
Mhm,
but I started to put applications into other places and knowing that I really needed to get challenged, and so that was probably the number one thing that I did was I took action
mhm.
to move out of that position.
Nice.
But if I was at the point where I was in, say, overload burnout, which I know we haven't talked about yet, but or habitual burnout, I wouldn't, right? I'm assuming at that point I might not have had the energy or the wherewithal to do that.
Right, and I know I struggle with it because it was interesting as you were speaking, I was thinking to myself, I was waiting for you to say you took action, right? Because I think
Mm,
that's the key is getting ourselves basically unstuck.
yes.
And I think as you go down that line in severity, it becomes harder. But then there's also this, and this is one of my intrinsic beliefs, is that people really do things when they're ready. And that can be really hard as a bystander
Mhm.
because, you might be going, I just want to shake this person because that all they have to do is make a change and they're going to feel so much better. But we really do things when we're ready, and everyone has that limit is going to be different. And,
Right.
as long as at some point you're doing something to get yourself out of that. I mean, some people, and I don't know if you've seen this, but I do think it's more in the severe stages. It, it's what's the word I'm looking for here? It's almost like they they don't, not that they don't know what to do, but they maybe don't know where to start.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so they're not even thinking about it. They're kind of, it's almost ambivalent to that idea of change at all.
Yeah.
And then something kind of sparks in their head or something happens where it's like, okay, maybe I do need to entertain this.
Yes. Absolutely.
I was going to say, why don't we jump to the overload burnout just because you brought it up?
Sure.
And I have seen this. I've seen this in a few different arenas, again, generally work related. But that's when you're working harder and harder in the pursuit of success.
Mm.
And as I'm saying this, I'm thinking, have I seen this with families? And I have seen this with parents where they they're doing,
Mhm.
and again, at what cost? And when I say at what cost,
Mhm.
I mean, are they giving themselves a break? Are they giving the kids a break? But it's that constant working harder all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking too, I could see overload burnout perhaps happening. I mean, it can happen with anyone, but I'm just thinking that when you're in college, I wonder, and I'm thinking grad school now.
Okay.
Um, I'm thinking back to my grad school experience, and I'm also thinking about some people in my cohort that I went to grad school with that were also working, and
Mhm.
I put myself in this category, and I was and so, yeah, I mean, my son at the time was pretty young, and he had already been diagnosed with autism, and, yeah, my plate was incredibly, incredibly full, and I don't think I ever reached overload burnout, but I can say, and I know we'll get into strategies, but
Mhm.
probably the 2 things that saved me, one was the support network I had, like a
Mm.
family that really stepped in and helped out, and 2 was just my passion for self-care.
Mm.
I still found ways to take care of myself. So, I probably
That's
came close though. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
that's no, that's really that's a great example because I hadn't thought about that
Mm,
from, and I think about when I was in grad school and I did work full time. I was in human resources at the time and I was a manager, and I remember having to make a conscious decision to drop a class and only basically do half a course load for a particular semester because there was no way I could juggle
mhm,
that role and
mhm.
grad school and do both well.
Yeah,
And I wasn't happy about it because the other thing is that then delayed my initial graduation date,
sure.
but I had to make a decision and I knew, sure, if I plow through this, I'm probably going to be miserable.
Yep.
And I can certainly tell you I was never thinking burnout. Like, I don't even know if I knew that word then.
Right,
But
right.
the example you're giving makes a lot of sense
Mm,
because it's that working, like, you wanna get good grades and you're going to school because this is something you're excited about, but you also have a job to do and you wanna do a good job at that, and it's demanding, and that's just 2 aspects, like, that doesn't take into account the rest of your life at all.
right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, no, this is really interesting to look at these categories and realize that, how much actually we may be able to relate to them.
Exactly. The last one that we haven't talked about yet is the neglect burnout, and This one, I've seen this a lot with clients where so it's defined as feeling helpless, believing that you're incompetent, kind of that imposter syndrome thing, and I I mean, obviously, I am not an expert in this matter, but I would be really curious if or how I should say neglect burnout and maybe overload go hand in hand, because one thing I've seen is when people have they either feel helpless or they have that imposter syndrome, is they work even harder because they feel like they have to compensate for what they're perceiving to be is their pitfalls or their lack of knowledge or their
Mhm.
inability. And I actually, now that we're talking about this, I think that could potentially be a very dangerous place where you really could tip into the overload pretty easily because you're feeling incompetent.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Yeah, I
Is
can
that
see sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, yeah, I absolutely see how those could go hand in hand. And one thing I'll add to it is, you had mentioned the imposter syndrome.
Mhm,
Um, I feel like maybe we talked about this before, but it it amazes me how many clients have brought that phrase up to me.
mhm,
I think that there's a whole lot more imposter syndrome, the idea of imposter syndrome going on than we realize.
yes,
Um, and and I agree that I think maybe one of the quote remedies, and I'm putting it in quotes because it's not a good remedy, but would be to, well, I better just do more, right? If
right,
I'm feeling incompetent, if I better do more to prove that I'm not an imposter.
right, and, I mean and I think we know and I can't remember if we've talked about this in the past, but oftentimes when that happens and you're pushing yourself that hard and you're like, "Oh my gosh, I gotta do more," that's when you also make more mistakes.
Yes.
And that's when, and it I think it then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of, "See, look, you're right. I don't know what I'm doing because
Mhm.
I'm so tired," not that I'm thinking about it that way,
Mhm.
or, I'm depleted, so hence my brain isn't firing on all cylinders. It's again, it's that slippery slope.
Absolutely. Yeah. So did
So
we cover all 4? Those were the 4,
we
correct?
did. Those were
Okay.
the 4. Right, right. So I'd be curious because 'cause I'm just thinking in terms of, I'm curious from a listener standpoint, what if you think about it, listeners, what would be the symptoms that would be like your red flags that it's like, "Oh, wait a minute. Maybe I need to slow things down." And I can tell you, and I'll be curious, Megan, before like you did your research, if there were any thoughts that came to your head, because I know when I first thought about this before I looked anything up or all I thought of was like exhaustion. And I
Mhm.
think it's
For
because
sure.
that's what I hear a lot.
Yeah.
And obviously that idea of like I don't care, like apathy. But beyond that, I didn't I mean, there were no like, "Oh, yeah, this is a hallmark kind of
Mhm.
burnout," and I didn't
Mhm.
know just from your before you did your research if there was
Mhm.
anything that, you know, you were surprised by.
I would definitely agree with the ones you already brought. Um, Another one I would say that comes up for me a lot working with clients, and I'm wondering like, is this a red flag of burnout?
Mhm.
I hear a lot about chronic pain.
Mm.
And in no way am I just wanna make it clear, I am not stating that I think it's in clients' heads. That is not what I'm saying at all.
Yep.
I too experience it. Like, I know for me, one of my red flags that I need to just take a pause is headaches. That
Mm.
is for me that it headaches for me is probably one of my number 1 ways actually that I know I'm either overloaded, I'm doing too much, or maybe I haven't balanced my life out in a given week, say, with downtime, with things that fill me with joy, all of that. So, yeah, I think that headaches and then just in general, I hear a lot about chronic pain.
Mhm.
Um, I think another one might be if you tend to get sick a lot, like if your immune system is just not great,
Mhm.
right? Like, geez, I just feel like I'm always getting a cold or those kind of things I think could also be, these are ways that burnout manifests. And so perhaps the moment you start to experience some of these symptoms, perhaps we need to take them a little more seriously than we do.
And I think you bring up a good point because 2 of the ones that came up for me were changes in diet and changes in sleep, and I see that a lot with my clients regardless. So many of my clients don't have good what I don't wanna say it's not that they don't have good sleep hygiene, but they really struggle staying asleep or getting to sleep,
Yep.
and and there's a myriad of reasons for that, and the same with diet, but it was interesting because I think to your point, when I thought about this, I said, "Okay, again, it means what are we paying attention to? And are we paying attention to the bigger picture? Because some of these things are just commonplace for a lot of people, but
Mhm.
is it an indication of more?"
Exactly. Exactly.
And I think the biggest one, and this was I know this is my personal red flag, but I never correlated it to burnout.
Mhm.
I correlated it to something else, but it's cynicism and distancing.
Yeah.
And I I have been able to look back and go, "Yeah, I have been there are times," and again, career-wise, where I have been cynical or I
Mhm.
have, just been like, "Get away from me, I'm good." But one thing that is true to this day, and I don't really even remember how I discovered it, but if I start to get in my head, if I start to get snappy, or one of the things I'm notorious for is I'll read emails and I talk back to them, or voicemail messages and I talk back to them.
Mhm.
And if I'm snarky, in that, that's my red flag that says, "Okay, you need to take some
Yep.
time off." And I thought that was interesting because again, I never correlated it to burnout necessarily for
Mhm.
myself.
Mhm.
But I do know for me personally, that is a red flag, which probably has prevented me from getting to the burnout stage.
Right, exactly. Maybe another way to just say it is it sounds like snarkiness could be the your red flag that then could lead to full on ambivalence, right? The
Right.
full on like I don't care anymore about
Yep.
something that in the past you did care about, right? And so, yeah, absolutely. These things like snarkiness, especially if it's not your in your typical personality, right? Irritability,
Mhm.
I know that's certainly a one for me. I'm not naturally irritable, but if it's been a long day, right, and I'm done with work and I might find, for example, maybe I don't have as much patience with the dog.
Mhm.
I'm and so again, it's like the more self-aware we are, we've certainly talked a lot about self-awareness through these podcasts too, right? Like, but the more self-aware I am, it's like, "Oh, okay. Yeah, I just got impatient with
Mhm.
Finley, and Finley's just being Finley, right? So let's take let's take a step back." Uh, yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is actually a nice segue into what can people do for lack of a better word, treatment of burnout? And I think you made a good point, which is, we've talked in the past about some of these things in previous episodes.
Mhm.
And I'm just curious when you think about that, what is the first episode that comes to your mind that would be a treatment? Like, it would be an answer to help?
Hmm. It's interesting. I'm drawing a blank in terms of naming one episode, but I think that that's because I see in all of the episodes we've done a lot of the strategies that we suggest,
Mhm,
whether we're talking about toxic productivity, whether we're talking about, chronic overwhelm, all of these things, I think that the strategies often sound similar because there really are. I mean, there's plenty that we can do, but I think that there's a handful of basic things
mhm.
that if we implemented them in our lives on a regular basis, we would be a lot better off. So I might punt that question back to you.
Sure.
Is there a certain episode you have in mind?
Yeah, actually, pardon me, and sorry to put you on the spot. That wasn't my my
No, that's
intention.
okay.
For whatever reason, the first thing that pops into my head is the last episode we did, which is on the
Mhm.
rediscovering joy. And I think because for me, it correlated to those different styles.
Mhm.
Right? Where I think when you have the potential, if you're in this burnout space, that you don't care, nothing matters, and so I think it's going to be hard to do some of the basic things that we need to do, right?
Mhm.
Which is prioritizing sleep and being mindful and those types of things.
Mhm.
But what I thought why I personally went to the joy part was because I think, especially in the bonus episode you did, you really gave an outline as to, okay, here are the different types of, I think there was like your play personalities. So, like,
Mhm.
be the
Mhm.
collector or the
Mhm.
kinesthetic person.
Mhm.
And for some reason, that's where I immediately went was, okay,
Mm.
here's a structure. And if you're truly burnt out, you might, we don't think clearly when we're in that spot. You might need a framework like that.
It's a
So that's just where I
great
went.
yeah. No, that's absolutely. And that's such a good example of how yeah, I think most of these episodes we've done are kinda all interwoven
Yes.
together.
Yeah. And I think it's great that we did that because that wasn't necessarily we didn't set out trying to do
No,
that.
no.
No. I think one of the things that is super important in terms of what I'm gonna call recovering from burnout and is to set, I guess, 2 things, like set a daily routine
Mm,
and set new priorities. And for me, they go hand in hand because if your priority, let's just say, for example, if you're burnt out from your job and that's been your priority and you're doing,
mhm.
it's going to be really hard to, come up with a new daily routine that isn't working. So you may have to say, okay, well, what are my priorities? Maybe one of my new priorities is rest or
Right.
mindfulness or play. So I think it's one thing to say, yeah, I've got to go do that. But I think it's another thing if you create a daily routine and structure your day so that you have these breaks, so that you have time for joy and time for a hobby and time for, you know, making sure that you're spending time with your family.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're making me think of I know there's some clients where we will literally go through their calendars, their schedules,
Mhm,
and they will agree to block time off for these things,
mhm,
just as you would if you had an important meeting, right, with a client or a boss or whatever. It's like, I okay, yep, that meeting is super important, and now how about from 10 to 10:30, you schedule in that walk
mhm.
or, and I think that, maybe for some people, it's a bit of a turn off to think of having, "Well, do I really have to be that rigid about it?" Not you don't have to be that rigid about it if you're good at doing those kinda things, but
Right.
if this is foreign to you, then I would absolutely suggest blocking it off in your calendar.
Agreed, and that makes me think of too, when we think of priorities, is it's very hard for people, especially when they're in this, e maybe approaching the burnout phase, or even if they're just juggling a lot and they're not even near burnout,
Mhm.
but prioritizing themselves.
Yes.
And, we've talked about this in prior episodes too, where making yourself a priority is, for some, they even believe it's selfish.
Mhm.
And I mean, but it's that oxygen mask thing, right? You've got to take care of yourself before you can take care of anybody else.
Mhm.
And I think if you're able to say, okay, I'm going to make myself a priority, or I'm going to make my, self-care a priority, or maybe it's even spending time with my kids or my animals or my spouse or whatever it is. And then what I often say to people too, who kind of balk about, like, I don't want to be that rigid. Well, we're also talking about establishing new habits. So
Right.
you're going to not have to, but many people have to have a structure in order to create a new habit. And then they can loosen up on that because
Exactly.
it's just part of their routine. And they're like, yeah, this is part of what I do.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a huge a proponent of healthy habits.
Hmm.
And I know those may sound boring, but I'm telling you that establishing just basic healthy habits in my life is probably the number one reason that I'm generally, I think, is healthy. I s- I stay pretty healthy, and
Hmm.
I it's and I agree with you that I used to be probably more rigid with some of these habits. And again, so I'm talking about things like establishing a basic sleep schedule, right? That you don't have to follow like to the minute, but are you getting, you know, a certain number of hours of sleep a night that's fairly consistent, right? Like that's just one example. Drinking water.
Yes.
Like these are really basic things.
Yep.
Meditation's very important to me. I'm not suggesting everybody has to do it, but like these things that may seem so basic. Sometimes I think they seem so basic that we overlook them.
Right. Yes. I think we take it for granted too. Like,
Mhm.
I think you mentioned that the sleep is huge. I mean, that's huge for me. And I mean, it's funny. Someone asked us, was it last week? They're like, well, what time do you go to bed? I'm like, well, the dogs go to bed at 8. So that's when I go up.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
my phone is off at 7 o'clock and comes back on at 7 the next morning.
Mhm.
But that's what works for me. And I know when I don't get good sleep, or if I go to bed too late, I just feel like junk. And it's the same for eating healthy foods, right?
Yep.
Like,
Yep.
I mean, you bring up the water, that's super important. And it's also about having, and I'm not saying, again, like, I'm not perfect by any stretch. I mean, there are times where I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot to eat lunch or whatnot.
Mhm.
But trying to stay, and I do this especially the days I go into the office, where I plan, okay, what's my day look like? Make sure I have all the food I need for the day. And, I make sure I've got my water, I've got my seltzer water, I've got whatever I need so that I'm set. There's no excuse. And I'm not sitting there going, I can't think because I'm not fueled.
Right. Right. Yep. And then over time, when you establish these healthy habits, you may not notice anything overnight, but maybe 6 months down the road, you're like, "Oh, wow." Right?
Right.
Like, I haven't gotten a cold in 6 months, or you name it, right? But you start to realize that these seemingly small changes can actually have really big results.
Right. Right. I think the other thing we haven't talked about yet is boundaries.
Mhm,
And
mhm,
I think it's important to have not just boundaries with work, but I think you may have to have them. It's about having I know we've talked about this before, a balance. And
mhm,
balance is very hard, but there's work-life boundaries, there's boundaries with family, there's boundaries with friends, there's boundaries with commitments. And I think that's a really big one because sometimes I think this is the downfall of what gets people into that burnout cycle is if they're always saying yes.
Absolutely. 100% agree. I know I've said this before in other episodes. I'm a huge believer in the the power of saying no.
Mhm.
And that doesn't mean you say no to everything. It doesn't mean that you say no to things that actually you kind of want to do. I'm talking about the things where you just know deep down it's like, "Oh my gosh, I can't fit that in," or I don't have time for that," or "I just want to use that time to read. I don't want to go out," or whatever it is, right? That
Right.
that you just you I think that there's power in practicing feeling more comfortable with saying, "No, no thanks. Thank you, but no, I can't."
Right.
And
Right.
by the way, you don't have to give an hour-long reason as to why either.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's I see that all the time where people
Yeah.
have they feel like they're owed an explanation.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. My husband is very good about his downtime because he works 6 days a week. So, if there is an activity on his one day off, it's really hard for him to commit, not because he doesn't want to. It's not like he
Mm,
doesn't want to, engage in that activity or doesn't want to see those people, but it's balancing, okay, what I have 1 day off a week. What do I wanna do or what do I
right.
need to do, And that's the tough part because sometimes people don't appreciate that, and it's like, "Oh, we never see him," and I'm like, "Well, he's gotta do what he's gotta do. It's okay that he can
Right.
say no."
Yes, I love that. So kudos to
So
your husband for being able to do that.
right? I know. He does a good job with it, and he's not fazed by it. I mean, well, I don't know if
Mhm.
he is internally, but externally, he's not, so
Good. Well, and also I'll just end with saying that's such a good example of can you imagine now for a moment if Sean wasn't good at that? And so he works 6 days a week. And can you imagine working 6 days a week and then on top of that, on the one day off you have, you feel like you're always just having to spread yourself thin for people or things or events or whatever that really aren't in alignment with what you need.
right.
He would be probably reaching, one of these categories of burnout that we're talking about today. So,
Exactly, exactly. Okay, is there anything I missed or any other kind of strategies to help recover from burnout that we didn't
I
talk
feel
about?
I feel pretty good about what we've covered.
Okay. Okay, so listeners, just a reminder, we've got one more episode before we close out our first season. And as always, if you have certain topics or things that you want us to cover, let us know. Be sure to tune into our next episode where we're going to be focusing on self care. So thank you all for listening and take good care.
Thanks, everyone.
If you want to share your thoughts or ideas with us, you can email us at therapyunpluggedpodcast@proton.me. Until next time, be sure to subscribe to Therapy Unplugged on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere you get your podcasts.